A couple of days ago, Apple, yes, Apple delivered what I think is a groundbreaking paper on reinforcement learning and autonomous driving. Should Tesla engineers be up at night stressing what Apple is doing and whether they might catch them? Well, we'll answer that in the video, but I think the more important part here is that we get some insight into what Tesla themselves is likely doing, even though they haven't told us in the past couple of years. So let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I'm going to try not to waste too much time because if you look at this paper and you look at how excited I was about it and the fact that I've basically outlined or highlighted most of what's in the paper, if there's more highlighting than there is not highlighting, it means I was very excited about the paper. So we should get to it in just a second. First, a big shout out to the Apple authors here. This is an excellently authored paper. Really, really good job. I appreciate well-written papers that really clearly get across the ideas that are important to this. Anyway, without further ado, you can see all of the authors here. They're all from Apple as far as I understand it, and it was released to archive on the 5th of February, so 4 days ago as I record this. Robust autonomy emerges from self-play. And by the way, if any of you authors want to come on my channel and talk about this paper or other things that Apple is doing or that you're doing on a side project or whatever, please do let me know. I would love to actually chat with you. So email me with the link below or hit me up on X. So if you have not seen my video about DeepSeek's R1 deep dive, you can check it out up here. I did a paper review. I'll put it at the end of the video as well, which is about a 50-minute review. I expect this will probably take about the same amount of time, that goes into detail about reinforcement learning and why it's so important to large language models. This takes reinforcement learning to autonomous driving, or full self-driving as Tesla likes to call it. So anyway, I'm going to read the entire abstract and then try to go through as rapidly as possible. There is an awful lot of stuff to get through in this paper. It's very, very exciting stuff. Anyway, the abstract says, self-play has powered breakthroughs in two-player and multiplayer games, obviously, and also DeepSeek's R10. Here we show that self-play is a surprisingly effective strategy in another domain, and that would be driving. We show that robust and naturalistic driving emerges entirely from self-play in simulation at unprecedented scale. In other words, they're doing it at an unprecedented scale, 1.6 billion kilometers of driving, or about 1 billion miles of driving. This is enabled by GigaFlow, which is a software package that these Apple engineers developed, a batched simulator that can synthesize and train on 42 years of subjective driving experience per hour on a single 8 GPU node. So let's break that apart for just 1 second. It does 42 years of driving on one of those refrigerator cabinets. That's 8 GPUs. This is not that much compute power. If you think like 50,000 or 100,000 of these GPU nodes that Tesla and xAI and others are building out, 8 GPUs is just nothing. And the fact that they were able to train this entire thing in 10 days to be better than the average, way better than the average human driver in simulation is pretty remarkable. And it means that the scale of this, the headroom on this is just incredible. Anyway, the resulting policy achieves state-of-the-art performance on 3 independent autonomous driving benchmarks. The policy outperforms the prior state-of-the-art when tested on recorded real-world scenarios, there's a big star on that there, amidst human drivers without ever seeing human data during training. And that is really cool. It was done completely by self-play, no human data as a kind of an example of what to do. The policy is realistic when assessed against human references and achieves unprecedented robustness, averaging 17.5 years of continuous driving between incidents in simulation. And the in simulation part of this is the big caveat to this entire paper. The paper is amazing, but it's entirely simulated driving using non-photorealistic input. In other words, it's not taking photons in, it's not taking recordings of videos of drivers or anything like that. It's not using anything like that. It's using simulated setups from Waymo and others to do the benchmarking and to do the reinforcement play. And that's one of the reasons they can do 42 years of driving per hour on 8 GPUs. It's just not that sophisticated at this point. The important part of this is that we've got a sparse reward function. They've got a very minimalist policy that they developed that's not even really a black box. It's got knobs that you can adjust after the training fact and adjust the driving and pedestrian and cyclist, etc. behavior through dialing these knobs. So it's actually really, really cool how they do this. But the big part is that they don't deal with the front end of all of this data, which is taking photons in and making sense of the world. They've abstracted that part away, which is the reason why I don't think Tesla engineers need to stay up at night. However, I think they probably are looking at this paper going like, this is very, very cool. Maybe it gave them some insights. The more likely probability for Tesla, however, is that they have been doing this for a long time. And this is one of the reasons why they think that they can achieve full self-driving in June, like fully autonomous driving. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. And I'll also leave it at the end of this video as well. So moving into the paper, we show that simulated self-play yields naturalistic and robust driving policies while using only a minimalistic reward function and never seeing human driver data during training. So I said pure play reinforcement learning like DeepSeek R10. So this is why I got excited about this paper. I was like, this is awesome. This doesn't need any kind of data from humans. It doesn't need a complex policy, doesn't need a lot of heuristics put in. You just put in a basic reward function and you train up a driving policy agent and a critic policy agent, and they self-play and they figure out how to drive effectively and very, very effectively. Superhuman driving capabilities, at least in simulation. And just for full disclosure, for over a decade, I have been a huge fan of reinforcement learning. I have felt like that was the way forward on pretty much every AI front. And this was before, deep neural networks were all that popular and everything. I thought that deep neural networks and reinforcement learning were the way to the future. The problem was that it was, well, number one, the compute power just didn't exist. Number two, the data didn't really exist to train these things to a state where they could be usable, where they could learn. And number three, the sparsity of the reward function. In other words, how do you measure whether there's success or failure was very complicated for anything beyond like a board game or something. When you look at like AlphaGo, AlphaZero or something like that, it's a board game. It's a very complicated board game, but it's a board game. And so it's a very, very contained universe. Driving is a very different world from that. And so is language and stuff, which is why reinforcement learning as a pure play has taken so long to arrive in the world of driving, large language models, math, etc., because they're just very open-ended problems. They're not contained like a board game. But my bias has always been that that is the answer. You will get there if you do reinforcement learning and a pure play reinforcement learning. And this is what we're seeing from this paper, which is why I'm so excited about it. So anyway, their GigaFlow is a batch simulator architected from the ground up for self-play reinforcement on massive scale. It's capable of simulating learning from 4.4 billion state transitions or 7.2 million kilometers of driving or 42 years of continuous driving experience per hour on a single 8 GPU node. So you can see my note here said, what would a whole data center doing this look like? How scalable is it? This is something we're going to get to in the discussion because I think it's very important at that point, but they don't need anything like that to do the training here. They get to orders of magnitude better driving than human drivers in the simulation just using one, one like refrigerator sized GPU rack. That's all they need. So here you can see that it simulates up to 150 agents all at once. Every single agent is trained individually without knowledge of the other agents, but they're all trained simultaneously through the same policy. That is really, really cool. And you can have up to 150 of them in any given scene. So a congested, you take a city intersection with 4 or 5 streets coming in, sidewalks, cyclists, pedestrians, trucks, cars, mini cars, motorcycles, whatever. You mix them in, you can have up to 150 of them. And that allows you to create very, very dense and gnarly sorts of situations. And all of the agents have to figure out simultaneously how to navigate through this scene. So it's very, very cool. And you can see here, I wrote a university has these resources. In fact, a person could almost have these resources. This is something that would be expensive, but not outrageous. You could plug it into the wall or something. And so the moat, the data moat is much, much less. Now, again, with the caveat that we've got the entire front end data moat. That's the elephant in the room in this paper. And of course, they do talk about it, but not until the conclusion. But anyway, for the rest of it, there's no real moat. There's no human data moat that's required. You just have to collect data about how to translate photons into an understanding of the universe. And that's just it's a very complicated problem, but after that, the moat is gone because this thing could just play forever. And so you can see here that they're only spending about $5 per million kilometers driven. That's cloud resources. I'm sure Apple gives them this so they don't have to pay for it themselves. But anyway, it can do 1 trillion state transitions or 1.6 billion kilometers of driving or around 9,500 years, almost 10,000 years of subjective driving experience and completes it in under 10 days on one 8 GPU node. So if it's scalable, you could do it in one day if you had 10 8 GPU nodes. That's not that much in terms of the world of data centers and stuff. And if you notice down here, they talk about a family of driving policies. So in other words, it's training up to 150 agents at the same time. So it's creating a family of driving policies. The parameters specify the type of traffic participant controlled by the policy. In other words, a passenger vehicle, a large truck, a cyclist, or even a pedestrian, and the driving style, aggressive, chill, all of that kind of stuff. So all of these are knobs that can be tuned and randomly set for the scene. So you can keep replaying it with a bunch of very, skittish drivers, chill drivers, a bunch of very aggressive drivers, etc. And really cool, these parameters can be modified at test time with no additional training. So that means you can just tweak these knobs afterwards and reset it so everybody's like super aggressive or something and see what happens. And here, this is really important. During training, this parameterized policy architecture enables all simulated traffic participants to be collecting experience in parallel, in other words, at the same time, all flowing through a single neural network. That is really remarkable. They're able to train all of these agents up to 150 at a time in parallel at the same time on the same road conditions versus each other. That's pretty darn cool. And then, as they say, this single neural network learns from all of their experiences, yet the agents exhibit diverse outward manifestations, truck versus bicycle, functional characteristics, turning radius, in other words, how tight can the car turn, and behavioral styles, adherence to traffic laws. And as they say, the result is a robust and naturalistic driving policy that achieves state-of-the-art performance when tested in recorded real-world scenarios. Again, it's like data. It's like little dots and stuff like that. It's not actually photons in or something like that. So we have to keep that in mind. But anyway, real world scenarios amidst recorded human drivers without ever seeing human data. In other words, human driving during training. So that's very, very cool. It's just able to learn by playing, and it figures out what driving is and what good driving is from just basic reward policy. And then you can see the results here that they're the blue bar here. They outperform the state of the art that was fine-tuned for each of these individual benchmarks: Carla benchmark, New Plan benchmark, and Waymo benchmark, or Waymo Open Motion Dataset, or WOMD. Anyway, they do substantially better, and it's a generalized model. The other interesting thing is how many miles, how many kilometers of driving they've done. You can see here that this is like the sun to the earth and then out to Saturn and stuff. And that pretty much everybody else, I believe it's not quite labeled here, but basically nobody else has driven even to like Mercury or something like that. And this effectively has driven to Saturn. So it's taken all these cars and it's driven them from the sun to Saturn. That's the number of kilometers we're talking about here. I'll also throw out my note here that does this require a theory of mind? In other words, these agents that are all having to project what other agents are doing just from the observables, which is where are they and how fast are they driving. It doesn't have any access to like acceleration, state of mind, intentionality, any of that stuff. None of that is apparent to the individual agents that are in the scene. All they can see is where they are and how fast they're moving at any given point in time. And that requires a theory of mind. It requires these driving agents to begin to understand what the other thing is thinking, right? It needs to have a theory of mind. It needs to understand what's going on in the other thing's mind in order to be able to drive effectively. And a theory of mind of other, there's a branch of psychology that says that that is the basis of consciousness. A really interesting book I read years and years ago called Born to Run, which talks about the theory that humans developed consciousness, language, etc. because we were persistence hunters. In other words, we couldn't run very fast, but we could run a long time, and so we would tire out our prey. But a community of people had to project into this animal what was going on in its mind, and we had to communicate with each other and say like, hey, we're going to collectively chase down this deer or something like that and tire it out until we can, then hit it with spears and then kill it and eat it. So, but that requires a state of mind. It requires this projection of a state of mind into other, and this theory is basically that human consciousness, that the sense of self and other developed out of that necessity. And if that's the case, we're talking about this being reproduced in these agents in this simulated world. They have to have a sense of other. They have to be able to project a mental space onto another entity and kind of figure out what it's doing from its external behaviors. And that, I think, is one of the coolest parts about reinforcement learning like this, where it can just play itself, is it begins to develop this sense of self, and agentic other. And how can you negotiate that? How do you negotiate the difference between yourselves and your intentionality, and looking at external behavior to figure out what internal intentions are? Very, very cool stuff. And then down here we get to the behaviors exhibited by the GigaFlow policy are naturalistic despite never seeing human data during training. In other words, again, it just learns how to drive properly through play. The trained policy exhibits long horizon planning, and this is one of the big things I constantly harp on about Tesla, is that it fails at long horizon planning. In other words, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, that kind of an idea of thinking about the future and setting yourself up for success. It's getting better in version 13, but it's still not perfect. But anyway, it actually, emergently comes up with long horizon planning without any dedicated planning or search modules, and it can deal with heavily contentious traffic scenarios, is quantitatively realistic when assessed against human references, and exhibits unprecedented robustness, averaging over 3 million kilometers or 17.5 years of continuous driving between incidents in simulation. And then down here, they give much more information about GigaFlow and what goes into it versus what comes out of it. So you can see the policy pi here depends on these factors, which is the state of the static world W, its own state S, and other dynamic agents A, in other words, things that are moving around, to produce an action A. So this is the action that comes out of these inputs. And then they provide a conditioning parameter C, which modulates the behavior. Is it aggressive? Is it chill? I think it might actually include like how big the vehicle is or something. Like, is it 1 meter long? Is it 5 meters long? Is it a meter wide? Is it 2 meters wide? That kind of a thing. How tight the turning radius is, all of that kind of stuff. I think that's in the state variable, but it might also be in this conditioning variable, but it's a little bit unclear. But anyway, they include that information in either S or C. So two factors are very important. Number one is uncertainty. You can't give these things perfect information about the world or else they don't learn how to drive properly. We, as human drivers, we can see what we can see. That's it. We are very uncertain about the state of the world. We just do our best to negotiate what we understand as that uncertain state of the world. And then, as I was talking about before, modeling agent behaviors is the other part. Because it's an uncertain world, you don't know intentionality. You have to model that and figure that out. So they said it's particularly impactful and complex aspect of driving. Again, as I noted, is this AGI? Is this the beginning of artificial general intelligence, the sense of conscious self versus conscious other? Maybe I should call it agentic general intelligence. It's still AGI, but slightly different. But anyway, here you can see from this diagram that they've got all of these worlds that they can train in parallel. And then within the world, they've got sort of lane markers. They've got the cars, which are just rectangular bounding boxes. Again, this is the problem, is the input phase. It's like going from photons to this map of the world. If we can get that step done, the rest of this is a freebie, basically. If you can model things to this extent from photons coming in, and Tesla has really solved most of this problem at this point. If you can get from photons into this sort of bird's eye view map of the world and an understanding of things, it looks like the rest of this is a freebie. It can just self-play itself forever. And then note that we have one policy for all agents. So even if there's a bunch of agents in the scene, it's one policy that does it, but the policy splits up knowledge. So it's not like each one of these agents knows what the other agents are thinking, but it's able to train all of them at once. So anyway, we've got the world, road boundaries, W boundary, W lane, W stop. So those are like, world states, things like that. Then you've got the vehicle state. Then you've got other agents that are acting in the scene. And then you've got conditioning and goals. And so each of these things is its own multi-layer perceptron, or, probably an attention mechanism or something, a transformer. It then gets max pooled and put into one generalized MLP, which is probably a densely connected multi-layer perceptron, and then output out of that is the action. So this is the stuff it knows. This is the inputs. It thinks about these things. Interestingly enough, the vehicle state just gets passed through from the MLP to the main MLP, and then you've got your conditioning and goals that are also passed through. The other ones have max pooling that goes on, more than likely to determine what to pay attention to in the scene. Then you get your densely connected MLP that then outputs an action, which is turn right, turn left, brake, accelerate. So again, the output controls are very, very simple in a car. It's just the angle of the steering wheel, the pressure on the accelerator, or the pressure on the brake. Then down here we get to the GigaFlow world is simple. We do not script scenarios, use human driving traces, or design delicate reward terms. They don't do any heuristic stuff. We show that simulation at massive scale, that's the important part, makes up for much of this simplicity, which is where we get to figure 2, which is the overall flow. So again, this is just super, super interesting. And of course, I will leave a link to this paper in the description. I don't have time to read all of this, but let's jump over to this blue highlighted thing. As training progresses, we can observe agents executing zipper merges. In other words, they zipper in as there's a lane merges out or something like that, and tight maneuvers in traffic jams, managing congested roundabouts and uncontrolled intersections. In other words, no lights, things like that, resolving occasional gridlocks and performing multi-point turns to reroute around accidents or obstructions. So they're able to go forward, backwards, move around, turn around, things like that. They're able to zipper merge. They're able to deal with congestion and a potentially aggressive or antagonistic behavior from other drivers and things. And all of this comes from self-play. None of it comes from human data. They didn't even start with, here's what driving is. They're just like, here's the scene, here's the reward policy, go for it. And I'm sure the things at the beginning were just driving everywhere and stuff, right? But after billions and billions of miles, you get things that behave not just like human drivers, but better than human drivers. So then speaking of the reward system, the agent reward is a mixture of incentives to reach its goal, obviously. I'm sure there's a time thing in there too, because you could reach your goal, but you could do it in like 5 hours as opposed to 5 minutes. That doesn't sound like a very, good objective. But anyway, so it's probably reach its goal in a given amount of time or as fast as possible. Avoid collisions, obviously. Drive centered in the lane and lane aligned, as well as penalties for running red lights or stop signs and exceeding acceleration and jerk limits. Jerk is the derivative of acceleration. It's the feeling of jerk, right? If somebody, turns really fast and hits the brakes or something and you're flopping around in the car, that would be jerk. So you want to reduce that. You want comfort for the occupants of the vehicle. It's not good enough if it's just going like that, right? You could, of course, include into this something like efficiency or something. So slow acceleration, slow deceleration, stopping minimally. You could add in other elements to the reward function, but this seems to be adequate to get the vehicles to drive very, very well just with these elements in the reward function. And I just want to call out this part down here because I think it's really funny. The agents learn a continuum of driving styles. Some drive cautiously, good. Others are likely to run traffic lights, while a rare few are willing to drive against the flow of traffic. I put down in here, this sounds like the Dominican Republic. I have experienced over there, you're driving down the highway and suddenly somebody's just going the other direction because they just felt like it. So anyway, there are places where people are willing to drive backwards to the flow of traffic. So I find it really interesting that if you create a very aggressive, assertive agent, that it will actually do things like drive opposite to the direction of traffic sometimes. And what that means is that the other 149 agents in the scene have to deal with some crazy person that's doing this. So it creates these sort of edge cases that you have to deal with in real life. And so as they say here, it has to learn to be robust to the unpredictable behavior of other drivers. And then they go through a lot of details about how GigaFlow actually works, and it's very, very cool. And then they also have an appendix about that too. So if you want to replicate this, you can actually do it. And very importantly, down here it says, critically, the entire trainable artifact is relatively compact at 6 million parameters. This is tiny. You think about something like a large language model like GPT-03 or something like that, which is probably on the order of a couple trillion, 1.52 trillion parameters. We're talking about 6 million parameters. No wonder this thing can operate so quickly. It's just basically a nothing model. It's tiny, which means it can also operate in way faster than real time if it needed to on an edge compute device. Now, of course, you don't have 8 GPUs in your car, but still, if it can operate a tenth as fast on the 1 or 2 GPUs you have in your car, that's way fast enough for this thing to be able to operate in faster than real time in a vehicle. So that's very, very cool. It's a super, super tiny model. And then they get to a big bugaboo about training models, which is that the better they get, the more sparse the information is that's interesting to the model. So they use proximal policy optimization, PPO, which is fairly standard for this stuff. But what this does is after a time, it creates an imbalance in the data. As training progresses, the on-policy data is dominated by ordinary traffic configurations, such as orderly driving in a straight line between intersections. It's just not that interesting. The critic is often able to accurately predict the returns for such trajectories, resulting in a large portion of samples with near zero advantage and consequently yield vanishingly small gradients. In other words, it just approaches perfection and there's just not much interesting that happens. So what they do is they use a variant of prioritized experience replay that filters samples that have minimal impact on learning. They filter up to 80% of samples with low absolute advantage, and I'm assuming that there's some sort of surprise feature. In other words, how different is this action from the expected action? The critic goes like, this is what I expect to have happen, and when the agent does something, it goes like, whoa, that's really different. Now, 99 times out of 100, it might be different and very, very bad, which is fine. You just, you ding it and you say like, that was a bad thing. But once in a while, it probably does something different than the critic expected. And it goes like, that's interesting. That's really cool. So I can train on that. So that's my assumption, is that there's some sort of like surprise feature. We saw that in R10 as well. There's kind of like a ground level. This is the stuff that's happening. And at the beginning, it's all very chaotic and noisy and stuff. But after a while, it settles down. And most of the driving here is very uninteresting, very boring. This is a problem that Tesla's talked about even years ago, is that 90%, 99% of the data that they're collecting is very uninteresting. They really need that interesting stuff, those weird edge cases to train on. So this is a way of doing that. They basically filter it out and only retain the interesting stuff that is useful for training this reinforcement network going forward. And then they talk about zero-shot evaluation. In other words, they take this stuff that they trained and they put it straight into these test simulators without any information. It's a zero shot. It's like, here you go, here's the network, put it in here and evaluate it and see what happens. And it does incredibly well. So you can see here they say, in contrast, we use a single policy as in contrast to people who fine-tune these things for each one of these metrics. We use a single policy across all benchmarks. Our policy is trained purely in self-play and is evaluated zero shot in each benchmark environment. In other words, it has no second chances. It's just like, here it is, plug it in here, see how it does. So the big ticket takeaways: GigaFlow policy generalizes to diverse actor behaviors. In other words, they can be cautious, they can be aggressive, they can be, a little bit chaotic or something like that. GigaFlow policy generalizes to diverse maps and driving situations, so that's obviously good. GigaFlow policy generalizes to real-world observation noise, which includes things like occlusion, incorrect or missing traffic light states, obstacles that are revealed at the last moment, etc. So we get a noisy world. We're simulating a world where there's not perfect knowledge, and that's very important because, perfect knowledge, like I said at the beginning, is not available. This one here is interesting. The GigaFlow policy approaches the ceiling of benchmark performance. And I was saying, I think here, 2025 is the year of saturation. In other words, all of these tests that we've come up with over the years, we're just saturating the tests. We're getting so good that the tests are not valuable anymore. They don't really teach us anything. So it's really interesting to see yet more benchmarks and yet a whole other field be saturated by these new networks. Very, very cool. And then they go into incidents that happen. And a lot of these incidents, it sounds like, are completely unavoidable. Like some of them are that a bad guy character, an antagonistic character, will actually spawn inside the vehicle, right? So you're driving along and all of a sudden there's a pedestrian inside the car. That counts as a collision, but that clearly is not a realistic situation. There are also things where you're just sitting there and somebody drives into you or something like that. So there's a lot of situations that are not caused by this network, and they go through each of the situations and look at exactly what's going on and figure out whether that's something that's the fault of the network versus the fault of something, some weird thing about the simulator. And basically what they find is there are very, very, very few instances where the GigaFlow network is actually at fault. Most of the time, it's the fault of the benchmark itself. Then we get to the analysis. As they say, GigaFlow has two neural networks: the policy, in other words, the actor that chooses actions, and the value function approximator, critic, in other words, the thing that goes like, how is the scene looking right now? How did you do versus what these other things are? That's kind of an adversarial network, very much like a GAN, like a generative adversarial network, where you have to train both of these things. The critic has to become better and better as the drivers become better and better. At the beginning, it's like, well, the person's driving off the road, so that's pretty darn easy to determine that that's not good driving. But later on, it's like, did they zipper merge at exactly the right time? The critic has to become more and more refined over time, just like the actor has to. And as they reiterate here, learning at scale yields mastery of complex skills. For example, unprotected left turns, a big one, driving in crowded roads used by both pedestrians and vehicles, and handling vehicles dangerously merging into the driver's lane. And all of this is contained in figure 3, so let's go ahead and look at this. This is a really, really cool figure here. It's a lot of information contained. But basically, green generally is good, orange is not so good, and you can see we've got, basically this is the number of iterations it's doing, the number of state examinations. So you can divide by somewhere between a factor of 10 and 100 to get to how many kilometers driven this is. But basically, as you do it more and more, you can see 10 to the 10th, 10 to the 11th, 10 to the 12th, you go from an orange situation to a kind of orange situation to a green situation. We have these really cool little boxes down here, which is, failed states, essentially. So you can see a lot of black here. So there's a lot at the beginning. We've got these really crazy things where all of these lanes are blocked with orange here, and the cars have to figure out how to negotiate around that. And over time, all black, it's just failing, less and less, more white, and then pure white, there's no failures. It's able to drive around these situations in an incredibly complicated situation where some of these actors have to make U-turns in the middle of the intersection in order to get out. Same thing with a zipper merge from a lot of lanes. It's, I think, 6 lanes down to 1. You can see at the beginning, it's just complete fail. And by the time we get to the end, they're all succeeding. They're able to zipper merge from 6 lanes down to 1, which is better than human drivers. I will guarantee you that. Then they get to danger evaluations, like how is it doing on that kind of stuff. And we get to figure 4. And basically, it's able to figure out, like down here, how dangerous is this situation. This is the most obvious one. If you're taking this corner, this very, very sharp left-hand corner at 36 kilometers an hour, yeah, it's okay. If you take it at 72, not so good. And then you've got, if a vehicle is going negative 36 kilometers an hour, in other words, if reversing very, very quickly, you've got this. If it's going 0, if it's sitting still versus going at 36 versus going at 72, you can see that the danger area, which is like this heat map, is adjusted based on that. And then really fascinatingly over here, a D on the right, long horizon decision making. This is again that bugaboo that Tesla full self-driving has had for years. What do you do? How do you plan ahead? Here you can see a situation where it sees that there's a blockage. I think it's 150 meters away. So very, very far away, a football field and a half away. It's able to see that and go like, oh, the best thing for me to do at this point is reroute and take a detour. And so it's able to figure that out on its own. That's pretty long-term planning. It's got to think about that quite a bit in advance and figure out where to go. Then you have here reacting to other drivers. It's figuring out what other drivers are doing. In other words, that agentic projection of mind into other drivers. Size conditioning. If it's a dinky little car, it can go around. If it's very skinny, if it's a big car, it has to do like either a U-turn or even a 3-point turn. So it's able to analyze its own self in the world and figure out how it's able to move around in the world. And it changes based on those parameters. Then we get executing maneuvers contingent on nearby traffic behavior. In other words, if there's no traffic around, it can do something versus a lot of traffic. It has to do a different way of acting. So that's really cool. We get policy reacts to potential events in the far future. We talked about that. It optimizes for long-term thinking. And this was not something they told it to do. It just figured it out. That's emergent behavior, and that is super cool. Then, as they talked about, you get a continuum of driving styles from very cautious to very aggressive, etc. And we also get GigaFlow yields a highly efficient, capable, and realistic simulation environment. So it's able to also kind of create these simulated environments on its own because the agents all behave well, and you can dial the knobs in given ways, and you could say like, hey, this is a crazy world where everybody's super aggressive and they drive on the left-hand side of the road, which, by the way, it actually trains for. I guess one of those tests actually has left-hand driving and stuff as well. But so you can do things where you have kind of one of those, like India kind of traffic situations where it's more like a fluid flow rather than an actual like individual cars or something. So you could, I don't think 150 cars is enough to simulate for that, but you could conceivably understand how it would be able to learn policies for even very, very complex situations where traffic laws are being, kind of obeyed, as opposed to like in the Western world where people are pretty rigid about following the rules. It could do traffic in more complicated situations, and that's a big unlock for this. And again, to reiterate, GigaFlow agents experience on average 17 and a half years of driving and over 3 million kilometers before encountering an accident. So, that's the kind of thing where if you drove for 40 years, like, you as a person, which is about reasonable, something like that, that means 2 accidents in the entire, lifespan of your driving. That's pretty good. And as they said, a lot of these accidents are kind of outside of the control of the individual agents, so that makes it even better. And then we get to the discussion and the big elephant in the room. First, our work has been conducted entirely in simulation. Techniques for transferring policies from simulation to reality will have to be brought to bear before claims can be made regarding the efficacy of self-play policies in the physical world. So yeah, and then they talk about the abstracting the perception stack. So in other words, they've just cut off the whole front end of this. I think the back end is pretty easy because again, the controls out as opposed to a humanoid robot or something. Very, very simple. Angle of steering wheel, pressure on accelerator, pressure on brake. There's only really 3 things that they're controlling for. And I think a very simple simulated model is perfectly fine for doing that, unless you're trying to deal with things like, bad road conditions and stuff like that, which it doesn't sound like they simulate in this circumstance. So, you would have to control for that. But generally speaking, the output control is relatively easy. Input control is a whole different thing. And that is the elephant in the room. That's the reason why I don't think Tesla engineers have to, lose any sleep over this, although I think it is really, really cool. And then finally, they say broader application of this methodology may substantially reduce the cost and complexity of training autonomous policies by meaningfully reducing the need for human data collection. So you could think about this not just for cars, but also for humanoid robots, that you would be able to train them all in simulation. Now, of course, we've seen NVIDIA doing stuff like that with their Isaac Gym and other companies. I think Google is doing something similar to that. So there's a lot of companies working on that for humanoid robot space, but it's really interesting that we're looking at not needing human data in order to train things. You just put a bunch of agents in the scene. The really cool part about this paper is that what they're doing is they're putting a whole bunch of agents. It's not one agent with a scripted bunch of others that are moving around. It's training all of the agents at once to behave appropriately with each other. So you could see how that could get transferred to humanoid robots, where you're training it to understand what a human being would do and then what your robot would do in that environment around them, but you're training all of it together to create kind of a simulated world. It's The Sims on super steroids. And so finally, let's discuss how this relates to Tesla, because again, Tesla is kind of the leader in this stuff. What they have that this paper doesn't have at all is that front end of the stack. Instead of abstracting it away, they've actually done the work to be able to turn photons into an understanding of what the world is around them. That is a massive, massive lift. That's something that Tesla's worked on for decades, requires a lot of data to do that. But once you get to that point, you can pretty much, it looks like, turn everything else loose and let it play. And my assumption would be, because I saw this a couple of years ago at the last AI day, which was way back in 2022. How sad is that? It's been 2.5 years since that. Tesla, you guys need to do another one. But anyway, even at that point, they had a simulator based on the Unreal Engine where they could put the vehicle into the simulator and drive it many, many millions of miles. You can imagine what they've done over time, that they've created a much more robust simulator. But that simulator, as opposed to this simulator, which just has little dots and lines and things like that, that simulator can actually be photorealistic and can be much, much more advanced and can actually teach the vehicles to drive themselves in very, very complicated situations. So imagine if you take this sort of top-down bird's eye view and you convert that so that you get 150 agents that are all looking out windows like, like a car would be doing with their 360-degree video views, and they're all able to play each other. So you take 150 of those instead of 150 little blocks. You take 150 of those, put them in a scene together, and have them learn over billions and billions of miles of driving how to do this. That's where 50,000 or 100,000 GPUs actually comes in really handy. And this is probably the reason why Tesla, again, thinks that they're going to be able to get to autonomous driving, full self-driving by June. So this paper from Apple is really, really amazing and very well written. And again, if any of you authors want to come on the channel, I would love to have you. But of course, the reality is that this is a long ways away from being in the real world, because it needs that front end thing where you're taking photons into the camera and you're turning that into this abstracted representation of reality that they're using in order to do the self-play. All right, so another long deep dive. I hope you all appreciate that. If you do, please like the video. It will help the video out a ton. And also consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.